Hello and welcome to Smaulgld's update on foreign holdings of U.S. Treasury securities. Re-dollarization continues as China, Russia, Saudis load up on U.S. Treasuries. Russian U.S. Treasury holdings are up 41% since October 2016, or 34 billion more U.S. Treasuries in Russia. That's the highest level of Russian held U.S. Treasury since September 2014. Over in China, Chinese U.S. Treasury holdings are up 53 billion since October 2016, and that was the last month that the People's Bank of China added gold to her reserves. Also, Japan, Brazil, Switzerland, UK, Saudi Arabia, India, and France have been boosting their U.S. Treasury security holdings. And Saudi threats to dump treasuries over that 9/11 issue don't materialize, as Saudi treasury holdings have increased 33% since November 2016. So higher U.S. interest rates, a new U.S. administration, improved Chinese and Russian finance have led to a surge in U.S. treasury buying. Let's take a look at some of the charts. So here are the overall amounts of U.S. treasuries held, and you can see this is on a truncated chart here starting at 5.9 trillion, but U.S. Treasury holdings by foreigners have increased about 128 billion from 5.99 trillion up to 6.123 trillion. But what's interesting is who are the players that are adding to their Treasury securities are the ones that are supposedly the most adamantly against U.S. Treasuries, the dollar, the ones that want to de-dollarize, the BRICS. Let's take a look. China and Russia. Also, we're going to look at Brazil and India, all adding U.S. Treasuries. So China and Russia, they have been very vocal about the dollar, and so has China, and they've come up with de-dollarization initiatives and trying to get more yuan acceptance and the belt and the different initiatives that they have created to use alternative currencies. However, they still recognize that there's plenty of commerce being done in US dollars. There's plenty of oil to be purchased from the United States, maybe not by China or Russia, but that the rest of the world is engaging in trade with the United States, and the dollar is needed. And also, US Treasuries are probably the best foreign or the best sovereign bond to hold, as it pays interest. And now that the Fed is raising interest rates and you still have negative or flat interest rates or zero interest rates at other sovereign entities, makes sense to hold US Treasuries. But let's take a look at what's happening to the Russian holdings. See, Russia sold off during the period when international sanctions were being put against them based on their Syria involvement, not their Syria involvement, but also their involvement in Crimea. And you could see Russia did sell off a very significant portion of her treasury securities down to 66 billion. And Russia also doesn't really need to hold treasury securities for trade with the US because they have very little trade with the US. They're an oil exporter, but the Russian central bank has been increasing their reserves, and they're over 400 billion now, and part of that reserve increase is the adding of gold and US Treasuries. You can see now at 108 billion, that is the highest position of Russian holdings of US Treasuries all the way back to September 2014. And just in the past 6 months alone, they're up 34 billion since October 2016. China had made a lot of noises about selling treasury securities, but they really didn't do it really until mid to late last year. And China had also, the People's Bank of China had, the reserve position had been over 4 trillion overall reserves, not US Treasuries, of which 1.2 trillion of those reserves were in US Treasuries. That had fallen all the way down by the beginning of this year, 2017, to under 3 trillion. They've built back those reserves over 3 trillion, and they're starting to build back their US Treasury positions, which are now at 1.1 trillion, just slightly below the 1.11 trillion that Japan owns. At one point, about 8 months ago, 9 months ago, the Chinese held more US Treasury securities than the Japanese, but that has flipped. But it looks like China is adding back US Treasuries. Here's an interesting one. Saudi Arabia. Now remember, in September of 2016, the United States Congress passed the 9/11 bill, which allowed U.S. families to sue Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia threw a public fit and said, look, if you pass that, we're going to dump our U.S. treasuries. Obama promised, the president at the time, promised to veto that bill. He indeed did, and Congress overrode it in a significant fashion. I think the Senate vote was 97-1. Congress also overrode it. Well, what's happened since Congress passed the 9/11 bill? Were there a lot of dumping of treasuries? Well, let's look right here. There's Saudi Arabia. Well, back in November, right after the bill was vetoed, but then ultimately passed by Congress, they had about 100 billion in U.S. Treasury securities. Did they dump? Nope. As of May, they're up to 134 billion. So they've actually increased their Treasury security holdings. I'm not saying it's in reaction to the 9/11 bill. However, it looked like they were supposed to dump their Treasury securities, and they actually have been adding. They added on a percentage basis more than probably any other country, 33% during that short time period. Brazil, one of the BRICS nations, dumping treasuries. 258 billion to 269 billion during the period November to May. That's up 11.4 billion for Brazil. Switzerland, always involved in the U.S. equity markets, also involved in U.S. Treasury markets, up 9.2 billion from November 2016 to May. UK, up from 215 billion to 234 billion, or another 18 billion of U.S. Treasuries there. And India, another BRICS nation, up from 118 billion to 127 billion, or plus 8.6 billion. So the BRICS have been adding treasuries. Swiss, UK, Saudi Arabia, and overall, as we saw up here, U.S. Treasury securities are once again, for the past 6 months, holdings by foreigners on the increase. Now, the dollar index, interestingly enough, has gone down during the past 6 months, corresponding to the period that we're looking at here. But you could see, this is the point I make, and people are aghast when I say it, but the dollar index is higher now than at any time when the Fed started and was doing its entire QE. You would think after they did QE that the dollar would have been destroyed, but it's because they spaced it out. They didn't announce here at the end of 2008, early 2009, that they were going to print 4.5 trillion and not stop for 6 years. Instead, you can see they started and stopped, and every time the dollar went low, these are periods of times when they stopped the QE and then they started again, and then the dollar went up. You could see here, still, this is very high on a historic basis, 96 over the last 10 years, even though it is the dollar index is falling down. Now, the dollar index is based on, I think it's the euro, the yen, the British pound, and the for whatever reason, I guess they have the Swedish kroner in there as well. But the dollar index is still very high on a historic basis. This period when the dollar rose was all in anticipation that the Fed was going to give up all this QE period here and was going to raise rates. And to a certain extent, because they have raised rates a bit, the dollar index has remained relatively robust. We'll see whether it breaks this line right here at 92. And then I would think that the Fed would raise interest rates at least one more time this year, because my view is that the Fed protects the dollar as well as looking after the economy and the too big to fail banks and so on. In any event, we're going to track this because this goes counter to the narrative dumping treasuries, death of the dollar, and so on, because you now see countries like Russia, China, Brazil, India, Saudi Arabia, all countries that supposedly were death to the dollar, and they're adding U.S. treasuries. Thank you very much for listening. If you're interested in adding gold or silver to your own reserves, you can do so via the site. Smaulgld gets a small commission. It's not investment advice, but you can compare pricing and shipping at BGSC, Golden Eagle Coins, SD Bullion, Money Metals Exchange, and you pay no more, no less than if you visited those sites directly. It's not investment advice to buy or sell gold or silver or anything else, but if you're going to do so, you've done your research, you can consider checking out the links on the Smaulgld site and also at the links below this YouTube. Also, if you're interested in trading cryptocurrencies, again, not investment advice that you get involved in doing it, but if you're interested, you can sign up Coinbase, and if you buy $100 worth of Bitcoin, you'll get $10 worth of free Bitcoin, and Smaulgld will get the same. Also, you can donate to Smaulgld via Bitcoin, via Litecoin at the links below. You could become a patron via Patreon at the links below or on the website, or you can just donate via PayPal. I do appreciate all of the donations I have received recently. Thank you very much for listening.